Good morning, everyone. On the count of three, I want you to say your name. 1, 2, 3. That's very good. You all know yourselves, don't you? Hey, names are very important, are they not? We know that experts in the field of, sociology and all of that tell us how important it is just to hear your own name. It tells somebody that you connect with them kind of immediately. It also increases some accountability, empathy. It improves the communication from the get-go. So those of you that are involved in sales, you know that learning and saying somebody's name is very, very important. In ancient days, a name could tell you a lot about a person. If I were just to say, for instance, the name McGregor, what would you think automatically? Comes from Scotland, probably. Okay, overseas somewhere. We would know back in those days that maybe even by that name, what region they were from, what dialect they spoke, so forth and so on. Today, names are important. We use them for our transactions. Just about every transaction you make has your name attached to it. There's bank notes and marriage and authorship and all that and beyond. And even in the world of the internet now, with social media and things like that, names are very important and tell us a little bit about a person. And we even make names up for some of that. And it simply doesn't just represent who you are, it is who you are. Your name, right? Or does it? For some, names are painful. Maybe they remind us of who we used to be. Maybe nicknames that were given to you can provide a negative or kind of a depressing identity. I could tell you some of the nicknames I had growing up, but some of you would remember them and reuse them, so I'm not going to. But maybe you were called stupid. Maybe you were called lazy, no good, something like that. And every time you hear that, or a derivative of that, it kind of just almost can send shockwaves through you. Because it reminds you of something very, 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 very negative, either real or imagined. And so names are very important. And what we are called is very important. I want you to remember that and think about that as we go through the message this morning. What we've been doing is going through a series of letters that were addressed by name to 7 different churches in Asia Minor in the book of Revelation. And those different churches were written about and to by Jesus himself. So how would you all like to get a personal letter from Jesus? And that's what these churches received. And so far we've taken a look at Ephesus down here and Smyrna last week we covered. Today we're going to be up here in Pergamum. And as a way of review, I found a little video on Revelation that kind of describes the whole book. And I just taken out this section, so it's a very short video of what the 7 churches were all about, what the letters were all about. So watch this video as a way of reviewing.
Jesus' message to the 7 churches. John was exiled on the island of Patmos, and he saw a vision of the risen Jesus exalted as King of the world. And he was standing among 7 burning lights. And John's told this is a symbol of the 7 churches in Asia Minor that's been adapted from the book of the prophet Zechariah. And Jesus starts addressing the specific problems that face each church. Some were apathetic due to wealth and affluence. Others were morally compromised. Their people were still eating ritual meals and sleeping around in pagan temples. But others among the churches remained faithful to Jesus, and they were suffering harassment and even violent persecution. And Jesus warns that things are going to get worse. A tribulation is upon the churches that will force them to choose between compromise or faithfulness. By John's day, the murder of Christians by the Roman Emperor Nero was past, and the persecution of Christians by Emperor Domitian was likely underway. And so the temptation was to deny Jesus, either to avoid persecution or simply to join the spirit of the Roman age. And Jesus calls them to faithfulness so that they can overcome, or literally conquer. And Jesus promises a reward for everyone in these churches who does conquer. Each reward is drawn directly from the book's final vision about the marriage of heaven and earth. And so this opening section, it sets up the main plot tension that will drive the storyline in this book. Will Jesus' people endure? Will they inherit the new world that God has in store? And why is faithfulness to Jesus described as conquering? The rest of the book is John's answer.
Okay, today, as I said, we're in the city of Pergamum. So if you have a Bible with you, I'd like you to turn to Revelation chapter 2. If it's on your phone, turn it on. Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And what I want to do right now is kind of walk you through a little bit of what Pergamum was like. Now, this is kind of the nerdy part that Corey has mentioned a time or two, and a little bit of the history of that. And this may not be your thing, but hang with me. We're going to get to the application sooner or later. I think it's important that we understand a little bit about Pergamum, because here's what I want you to do. Remember how important I said names and reputations are? Sometimes when we think of some of these 7 churches, we think there's certain things that come to mind. And after we're done with this whole series, that will continue to happen, okay? You'll think of Ephesus, and you'll remember those people are the ones that lost their first love, all right? And so when you think about Pergamum, there's going to be something that you're going to think about after today, so forth and so on. And I want you to compare what you're going to hear about Pergamum, that culture and that time, some of this little nerdy history stuff that we're going to talk about, to where you're living today. Because as we've said before, that these 7 letters were written a couple thousand years ago to 7 real churches, real people lived there, just like you and me. But it wasn't just separated by 2,000 years. It's timeless and universal truths. That means it's just as applicable today. That's one of the miracles of the Bible, by the way, is that it is good for all people of all ages, of all cultures, all times. And so as we kind of walk through what Pergamum was facing and what the church was facing in Pergamum, what it would be like to be a Christian in that city, I want you to think about where you live. The context of our country, the context of the Colorado Springs community, the context of maybe where you work and where you live on your street. So just make a comparison there, okay? Don't just think of it as an ancient city a couple thousand years ago. It has no relevance. All right, so let's get started. It was a major city, just like some of the other cities that we've talked about, city of importance. It was, as a matter of fact, a capital city in that area, in that part of Asia, and that's important to remember. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It was a large city, very cosmopolitan. They had this really cool theater. And one of the things that made their theater unique than other large cities was it was the steepest in the world. I don't know how many of you get dizzy if you go down just to the World Arena or out to the Air Force Academy, the football stadium out there, but this had a really steep pitch to it and held about 10,000 people. They also had there a library that held 200,000 volumes. You say, well, that's not a lot necessarily for a big city to have. But remember, they weren't books. They didn't have books yet. What did they have? It's big scrolls. So for those of you that are into building shelves, can you imagine the shelves that they had to have built to hold 200,000 scrolls? It was also called the breadbasket of the region. They did a lot of growing of grain, and you'll see why in just a little bit, but they were very well known for a lot of agriculture. Matter of fact, they got so good at growing grapes. Their vineyards were world-renowned. At one point in history, Rome went and destroyed them all, cut them all down, because they were competing too much with the vineyards in Italy, and they didn't like that. So they were also, and this is an important fact, a very religious city. As we've seen in the other two, in Ephesus and Smyrna, they were even more so. They had a lot of different temples, a lot of different worship going on there to a lot of different gods and goddesses. So I want to kind of tackle that a little bit now, because it's going to help us understand what Jesus said and why he said it. Okay? So for instance, the gods and goddesses that they served. Number one was a guy by the name of Dionysus. Dionysus was a god he was basically the god of pleasure. Okay? Can you imagine that? His dad was Zeus. He had an earthly mother. And his job was to help everybody feel good. Plain and simple, that's it. It was kind of bizarre. As a matter of fact, if you went into the temple of Dionysus, there would be an altar there, and the way you started worship, the way you worshiped this god, was to get your belly full of raw meat. But you would just eat and gorge yourself, and then you would just start chugging the wine. Okay? And drinking the wine till you were totally crazy, blind, drunk. And just have a good time. Do whatever feels good. Women would get so drunk, they would leave the temple and run through the hills above the temple there, just naked and crazy and committing all kinds of sexual immoral acts. And it was just plain bizarre. in their celebrations, it got so raucous that oftentimes people would die. You know, they would just get so out of control, they would kill themselves, they would die, they would be killed by somebody, or as you can imagine, stuffing your belly full of raw meat and drinking a bunch of wine, that probably can't be the healthiest thing in the world for you. So anything to bow down before the God of pleasure was considered an act of worship. Now, this is where I want you to start comparing and thinking of things. When you bow down to the God of pleasure, when you give in to, well, whatever feels good, without considering what Jesus would want for you, you're basically in an act of worship to the God of pleasure. Okay? And by the way, this was so weird, this worship in Pergamum, that it was outlawed in Rome as being too dangerous and too immoral. The Roman people in Rome would actually not even allow it in their city. That's how bizarre it was. So that's just one of the gods. They had dozens. Another one was Demeter. Demeter was a goddess. She was the goddess of grain. Now, she was a little more civilized, a little more sophisticated. Okay, she wasn't quite as crazy as Dionysus, but what she would do is that she would provide a good harvest. And so she was kind of also considered the goddess of harvest, and she would be also the goddess of fertility. So you can let your imagination go with that one a little bit if you want. She would also have the power to forgive you if you had done something wrong, anything. You could just come to her and you could say, Demeter, I would like to have a good crop. I'd like to be able to provide for my family. We need some food. So you just pray to her, can you please do this for us? And by the way, I messed up. And you would confess. But here's where it gets weird with her. The way that she would forgive you would be you would go and you would make your confession to the priest or priestess or whatever, and then they would bathe you in bull's blood. Just cover you. That sounds kind of bizarre. Except for the fact that when we talk as Christians, we say, we have been washed in the blood of the Lamb. As we think through all of this, I just want you to remember that Satan is the great deceiver, right? He always has a little bit of truth in just about everything he does. So they could say, we've been washed in the blood. Wrong animal, has nothing to do with Jesus. But that's how Satan is. He takes a little bit of truth and then messes it all up. So that was Demeter, a little bit about her. By the way, we could kind of give her a nickname. She was the goddess of grain, but I call her the goddess of groceries, because if you needed food, that's who you went to and prayed to. Let me give you a third one. Asclepius, the god Asclepius. He was the god of healing. And this one really gets bizarre. How many of you like snakes? Anybody? I actually had some people raise their hand. You do? Okay, well, I guess you're just one of those weirdos. But anyway, we're glad to have you. I had several people on first service raise their hands. They like snakes. But this is bizarre. Listen to this. I don't think you'd like it this way. If a person needed healing, he would go to the temple, or she would go to the temple of Asclepius, and you would be put to sleep. You would either say, here's the nap room. I don't know what they did. They had these little tables or what they had, that you would lay down and go to sleep. And we think they probably had some kind of drug that they would give you to help you fall asleep. Maybe they did it at night when you were ready to go to bed anyway. And you would have a vision during your sleep, during your nap time. And during that vision, you would be told by the god Asclepius as to what your diagnosis was and what you should do. So you would get this plan of health. And so you wake up and you go tell the priest what it was, and they say, okay, this is what you need to do. And so they would give you, and much of it was really kind of normal stuff. You need to eat better, you need to exercise. And by the way, that theater was named after Asclepius, and you need to go to the theater and see a good show and relax and get rid of all the tensions. And so there would be, kind of normal stuff. But here's the abnormal part, that in that room where you went to sleep, you know what they did? He was also the god of snakes, and they would release a bunch of non-venomous snakes to crawl all over you while you're sleeping. And if you had a snake crawl over you, that was a good thing, because that snake was going to put that vision in your head that you could get healed from. Okay? So that's a little bit of Asclepius. And by the way, what is the symbol for the medical field right now, for those of you that are in medicine? the snakes on the pole, right? We date it back to Asclepius, by the way. That's where it comes from, or we think it comes from. So there's other gods, there's more. There's Athena, there's Zeus was a temple there. They worshiped Zeus, the king of the gods, in his power and everything. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, especially if you're in warfare and you were going to go into battle, you would pray to Athena for wisdom. But the clincher was they also had a temple. Not every city had this, but they had a temple, and so did Ephesus, to the Roman emperor. Because remember, the Roman emperor thought he was God. Some of them thought that he became a god before they even died. Domitian, who was probably in power when this was written, was one of those guys. Augustus, after he died, they declared him a god, so they would pray to Augustus there in Pergamum and other emperors, and they would also make sure that you prayed to Domitian. Here's the deal. These emperors, not only would they think they were gods, but they had titles attached to them. And you use these titles in your prayers and in your worship of them. Titles, and Corey mentioned this last week in Smyrna, like Kyrios, which means Lord. They would call him Lord. They would call him Savior. They would basically say, by the way, the emperor at Athena, at the temple of Athena is where you went to worship him, was God over all the other gods. God over all the other guys. Something that I learned a little bit about, that I knew somewhat about before this, but in my study I found out that a German archaeologist went to Pergamum and found out that they weren't taking care of these ruins, and so he had all of Athena, that temple, taken back to Germany. This was before World War II in the 30s, and they rebuilt it. And this temple to Athena and to the emperor, they say, was something that maybe inspired some of the lunacy of Adolf Hitler, of having it there. Okay? So anyway, this whole thing about worship and stuff kind of became just ingrained in part of Pergamum. And as I noted, Pergamum was a capital city in the area of Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. And the governor there, they had a governor there who was, different than other rulers from Rome, but he was in charge of this whole area. And so the governor resided there, his home was there, he participated in all this, and he made sure that much of the worship was done correctly, especially the worship done to the emperor. And this particular governor was granted a special privilege in Pergamum. He was given what was called the right of the sword. And the right of the sword, for a Roman ruler to have that, was very special, because what it meant, it gave him the privilege, if you want to call it that, to decide life or death in any case that was brought before him. It didn't matter what it was. Or if he just wanted to decide on something, on some public figure, or some person that was just walking down the street, whether or not you remember this from any of the movies, they lived or died. That was what's called the right of the sword. And typically, what would happen is, if that governor was, going through, the public areas, the agora or whatever it was, the marketplace, he would have somebody walk in front of him carrying a sword above their head. That was their job. And you know what that did? That was meant to strike fear in the hearts of everybody that saw him. Basically as a warning, saying, be careful, because this governor has the power of life and death. And just with his thumb, he can decide, point you out and say, live or die. You bring a case before him, he can say, live or die. That was the power of the sword. Not every Roman ruler had that authority. Of course, the emperor did, but this particular governor who lived in Pergamum, it's important to remember that, had that authority, had that power. Okay, so this was Pergamum. Pergamum was a place to go if you needed a place to go. And by that I mean, let's just say your life was getting a little boring, or you weren't quite cutting it where you were at, or you wanted to make a move, or you at least wanted to go visit someplace. It was Chicago, it was New York, it was Vegas, it was LA, all in one. It was the happening place. Because they had all of this stuff that could provide for every need, everything you wanted. You want to have some fun? You want to have some pleasure? You want to just get away, as the commercial says? You can go to Pergamum and go to the temple of Dionysus. If your crop hasn't been too good the past few years and you needed to have some prayers, you needed some food to put on the table, you need to provide for your family, you go to Demeter's temple. If you were sick and having some health problems, didn't know where to go to Asclepius and have some snakes crawl all over you. Get a diagnosis. Okay? And if by chance you needed some power, you needed a savior, you really were ready to take on the world, go and pray to Zeus, or better yet, to the emperor, and worship Caesar. In other words, Pergamum was the place to be, where the action was. Now, I want you to think about all that, and think about maybe where we live today, and we're going to read the text together. Actually, I'm going to have it on the screen, and what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through some of these things, and I think you'll see why it's important to understand some of that history and understand and compare it to where you live today, all right? So let's start with verse 12 of chapter 2, and it says, "And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword." Let's stop right there. He's speaking of Jesus. He's speaking of himself. He's writing to this, and the first thing that he wants them to know is, I know that every time you're out in public and the governor that comes by and he's got that guy walking in front saying, "I've got the power of life and death," I want you to know, church, that that's a bunch of baloney. That I, Jesus, am the only one that has the power of life and death. This was in direct contrast to what was happening there in Pergamum. Okay? That's the first thing that he notes. Then the second thing he notes is, I know. Last week, Corey explained to us just how important it is for us to understand, I know. When Jesus says, I know where you're at, I know what's going on, I know where you live, he says, where you dwell, that just kind of can just take the edge off, right? Isn't that what we all want? Don't we want somebody just to know where I'm at? I just want somebody to understand, to get it. And Jesus says, I get it. I know where you live. And he explains it. He says, where Satan's throne is. I know how bad it is in Pergamum. He knew all about all of those temples. Believe me, he knew about it. He knows about what's going on in our culture. Believe me, he knows. Okay? And he calls it the throne of Satan. That's how bad it was. Now that word thronos, which is the word for throne in the Greek, is a word that everybody in Pergamum would understand. Matter of fact, everybody in that part of the world would understand. You know what it is? It is, because it was a patriarchal society, every house had a thronos, just about. Okay? And that was the chair where Papa sits. Okay? You got one in your house? Kurt, you got one in your house? Anybody have one? Chris, you got one? This is Dad's chair, okay? And then, all you got to do is if there's a little urchin or a little kid in there, all you got to do is stand beside it and look at them, and they jump up and get out, right? Well, maybe it's not quite that way in your house, all right? It never was in mine anyway. I didn't have a thronos. But anyway, every house had, and literally nobody sat in that chair except the head of the household, the man. That's what the word thronos meant. Now, why is that important to understand? It's important to understand because when Jesus says, I know where Satan sits, I know his thronos, he says Pergamum is like his kingdom. He is saying, I am in charge here. This is my place. And he is acknowledging to those Christians, I know where you live. I know that Satan thinks he's in charge. But what Jesus is going to tell them is he's not. You don't have to succumb. You don't have to give in. Okay? Satan may think he's in charge, but he's not. Let's read on. It says in the next verse that yet you hold fast to my name. So Jesus is telling the people in the church, you're hanging in there. You did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas. Antipas was a martyr. We think he was probably a leader in the church, maybe the leader of the church at that particular time. He calls him his faithful witness who was killed among you where Satan dwells. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to Antipas, but he was martyred, and it probably set off a bunch of other martyrdoms as well. And so here the leader of the church he has probably been preaching, don't bow down to Caesar. Never go to any of these temples and worship. You are a faithful follower of Jesus. As he was preaching that, he was building up the church. They probably knew about it. The governor probably knew Antipas. Okay. And one day, the governor is going out in public, and he's got this guy in front of him walking. I've got the power of life and death. I have the right of the sword. Everybody will worship Caesar in my kingdom. And there Antipas is over on the side, refusing to bow down. And the parade stops. And the guy with the sword goes, oh, here it comes. I get to use this thing finally. And he points out Antipas and says, he dies. And so that set off other martyrdoms. And he says, I know that you didn't give in when that happened. You stayed true to my name. That's wonderful. Wonderful. We got people dying. He says, don't worry, hang in there. And this is what he says next. He says, but I have a few things against you. So here's the correction. So he's just given the greatest commendation ever for their faithfulness. But here, there's some things wrong in the church. There's trouble in the church. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. I got to tell you a little bit about this story in case you're unfamiliar with it. It's an Old Testament story. Balaam was a prophet that was world-renowned for his blessings and cursings. If he blessed you, that was a good thing. If you cursed, that was a bad thing because it always came true. When Balaam listened to God, he got a little heady, he got a little proud, a little arrogant, and one day this guy named Balak from another country who was going to fight against Israel said, hey, Balaam, why don't you come over to my side, come to the dark side and curse Israel. Bless us, curse Israel. So Balaam says, well, that's a pretty good idea. So he's on his way. There's a donkey involved and an angel that stops him. If you haven't heard that story, you ought to look it up sometime. Look up the story of Balaam and the talking donkey. I'll just leave it at that. But basically, it stops Balaam in his tracks. He doesn't do that, except when he leaves there, he kind of skirts around and goes to a place called Midian, also enemies of God. And this is what he tells him. This is what he tells him. He says, listen, if you want to defeat God's people, I'm not going to give you any warfare strategies, but this is what you need to do. You get them to compromise. You get them to worship other kind of idols. Get them involved in a little sexual immorality. Get them involved in a little bit of sin. Just let it build, let it grow. And God will do the defeating for you. So he was encouraging that. And what Jesus is saying here is there are some in the church that have done the same thing. Oh, we can go to Dionysus. Oh, we can go to Asclepius. Oh, we can just pretend that we're worshiping the emperor. We don't really have to. And so they were chiseling away. We can be involved in sexual immorality just a little bit. It doesn't matter. And he says, you got some in the church that are actually doing that. And Jesus is telling them, it does matter. Behavior matters. Look at the next verse. He says, so also you have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. We've talked about those guys before. They're people who said they were Christians, but they had this philosophy. It's not even a theology, it's a philosophy. And it said that what you do with your body doesn't matter because only thing God cares about is your heart, right? We've heard that before. Oh, he has such a good heart. You know, he may be a complete immoral, person that doesn't care about who they hurt or what they do, but they have a good heart. And the Nicolaitans said that's all that matters. Now, there's a little bit of truth to that. There's a little bit of truth to the fact that God really cares about our heart. He knows what's in our heart. But he also cares what our behavior is as a result of our heart. And so he said, I hate the work of the Nicolaitans, but there's some in the church that are teaching that. Therefore, repent. Pretty simple, right? He doesn't go into a big, long list of do's and don'ts. He just says, repent. Quit thinking that way. Quit pretending that it doesn't matter. It does matter. He says, I will come soon and war against them with the sword of my mouth. And the sword, by the way, is also compared in the New Testament to his word. Okay? A sharp, two-edged sword is the very word of God. In other words, listen to this, truth versus falsehood. The teaching of Balaam, teaching of the Nicolaitans, that's all false. It's all pretend. That's all just the deceiver. But Jesus says that when I fight with truth, the sword of my mouth. Next verse says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's another way of saying pay attention. We've seen that. We'll see that in every church. He says, pay attention. If you have that heart, then listen up to what I'm saying. And the one who conquers, who is faithful, who hangs in there, he again doesn't give him a long list of things, of do's and don'ts. He just says, just be faithful to what you already know. I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. I want to talk a little bit about those two rewards, but before I do, let me just say this, that the big idea here is very simple. This morning, I want you to remember the fact that Jesus is calling this church in Pergamum, and he's calling you and I to no compromise. Okay? Truth versus compromise. He's telling us, don't compromise. Don't cave. Don't give in. Don't quit too soon. Don't stop. You know, Satan loves compromise. That's where he dwells. That's where he lives. He's comfortable there. That's his thronos. As a matter of fact, this word throne is something that designates the idea that I am comfortable sitting there, living in this compromise. And the Christians at that church in Pergamum, most of them were challenging that. Yet some were tempted to cave in, to compromise. So fudge a little, just look the other way. It doesn't matter. See, the problem wasn't that the church was in Pergamum. The problem was that there was too much Pergamum in the church. He said at the beginning, I know where you live. I know where you dwell. You know, and I hear that a lot. The problem for us is not that we live in a heathen culture. Because, I hear the complaints, and here we are in another election year, and that, oh, this is so terrible, and where we live is awful, and our values are being destroyed, and I get that, and I agree. Things aren't the way they used to be. But that's not the main problem. It is a big problem, but it's not the main problem, because our problem is not that we live in a corrupt culture. Our problem is that there's too much of the corrupt culture living in us. You see what I'm saying? There's been a lot of corrupt cultures that Jesus have had churches in, all over the world, all through time. A lot worse than ours. That doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it, that we shouldn't stand up for what is right and all that. We should. But just understand that Jesus is calling you to live out your faith right where you're at right now. And when it comes down to this, anytime that when we live in a culture that's corrupt and we seek provision or we seek to have our needs met outside of God, outside of Jesus, we are compromising. Because he said, you have everything you need, no matter what culture, no matter what time you live, no matter where you live. And worse yet, don't dwell there. Don't get comfortable there. And that's been Satan's plan all along from the very beginning. Even when he asked Eve in the Garden of Eden, he said this. He kind of snuggled up to her before snakes were really ugly and nasty. He said, did God really say you can't eat of any of the trees in the garden? And Eve's like, oh yeah. Not only that, he said we can't touch anything either. Which God never said. You see, Satan's goal is to always put doubt in your mind and in your heart about what God says. Did God really mean for you to not do that or to do this or whatever? And all of the false gods in Pergamum that took credit for what God should be doing in their lives, providing life, giving you meaning, giving you significance, was in the city where Satan dwelled. And he says, I'll do that for you. I'll do that for you. Satan wants us to think that everything we need for life, even eternal life, forgiveness, whatever, it can be found through your own efforts or through seeking it out in some other means. If instead we continue to seek out Jesus, to seek him alone for our needs and for what we want, not through our own efforts, he says he will give us that hidden manna, and he will give us a white stone with our name on it. Let me go back to that verse. It says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give him some of the hidden manna. Manna is another Old Testament story. When the Israelites were leaving Egypt and wandering around the desert, couldn't provide for themselves, he miraculously provided manna, which was a bread type of substance that they could have every day that just appeared miraculously. He says, I'll give you some. It's hidden. Nobody else can see it. So don't worry. I will provide for you. And not only that, I am going to give you an identity on a white stone that nobody else knows. And isn't it just like Jesus to kind of get down and talk to us like we're one-on-one? Makes you feel like you're the only person in the universe. And by the way, no one else is going to know this name but me and you. That is true. You have a name that Jesus is going to give you when you leave this world and go to eternity with him that only you, I don't know how he's going to work that. What do you think that name would be for you? I got lots. But I know that he's going to provide for me. And I know that in times of persecution, I know that in times now when everybody's on edge and we're in this pandemic and things, you can really be tempted, by the way, now to seek things that you think you need outside of God right now in these difficult times. Tempted to go to other gods for provision. We may not call them gods, but basically he's whispering, did God really say? Yeah, he did. Matter of fact, Jesus said, John recorded it. Also, Matthew recorded it. Luke recorded it. That if God takes care of birds, isn't he going to take care of you? Even in times of pandemics, even in times of trouble, of difficulty, why would you seek help anywhere else? Why would you go to Dionysus if your life is boring, if it's hurtful, it's confusing, or just plain no fun? Why would you do that? Why would you go to Demeter if you need provision? If you're scared and not sure where your help is coming from? What is your Dionysus? What do you go to for pleasure? Is it from God or is it something else? God wants you to have fun, by the way. I'm not a party pooper. I love to have fun, right? But I want to have the fun that God provides. I want to have the joy that he provides. I want the provision that comes from God, not from someplace else. I want the healing that comes from God. So I'm not going to go to something else. I'm not going to go to a Clepius, a false god. You know, I know that we have doctors and nurses and science today that I think God uses all of those. But where do I go for my mental healing? You know, I know a lot of people, sometimes even Christians can say, you ever said this? You know, when after a hard day of work or a difficult time or period in your life, I just need a drink. You know, you say, well, drinking isn't wrong. It's not condemned in the Bible. No, but drunkenness is. And if you have one beer and then 2 beers and then 3 beers and then a couple shots because it's just been rough. I just need some help. I just need to get into this dark time. Those kinds of things. And it doesn't have to be alcohol or drugs. It could be a hobby. It could be work. It could be anything that you choose to do, that you are seeking healing, you are seeking provision, you are seeking anything that God says, I will provide for all your needs. If you're seeking it outside of God, it's compromise. Plain and simple. Worse yet, if you go to the emperor of the age and seek salvation and seek significance and seek the meaning in your life instead of Jesus, it's compromise. He says, I'll give you the manna, I'll give you the provision that you need. And then here's the exciting part that I like. I will give you an identity. I will give you a name written on a white stone. Because we're always tempted to make a name for ourselves, are we not? Satan is constantly trying to deceive you in something that you're not. He'll do 2 spectrums. One is he'll appeal to your arrogancy, and he'll tell you something that you're not, your pride. You're all this in a bag of chips, right? He'll also appeal to the negative side of you and say, you're nothing, you're a nobody. And he'll put you down. Or he'll just say, you're in the middle, you're just average, when he has great things planned for you. Well, when you became a believer in Jesus Christ, I want you to know and be reminded of this, that 2 Corinthians 5:17 says that you are no longer the old person that you were. You're now a new person. If any person is in Christ, behold, all things have become new. Everything in the past is gone, including your identity, and now Christ puts his identity on you. Every person who has accepted Christ has a new identity in Jesus, and Satan will spend the rest of your life trying to deny that for you. The temple of Asclepius, if you went there and got healed, you had the snakes crawl over you and do all that thing, you could have, they had big white blocks of stones, testimony stones. You could have your name chiseled in there, and then what you were healed from chiseled in there as a testimony, okay, to what happened to you. I don't think it's any mistake that he said, I'm going to give you a white stone with your name on it as a testimony to what I've done for you. You're going to get a new name. That's what that white stone was all about. It was in contrast for what Pergamum had to offer, to what that goddess had to, or that God had to offer. Jesus says, you don't want that testimony. You stay true to me. You conquer, you're faithful, and I will give you a name that only you and I know. The big idea, don't compromise. Don't compromise. I had one of the small groups that I'm participating in here in the church. Not long ago, we were talking about heaven. And I just, out of curiosity, I said, what do you guys think you're going to be like in heaven? What are you going to look like? How old do you think you'll be? Just some fun. We were just kind of, throwing some ideas around. And everybody was kind of chiming in. This is what I think I'm going to be in heaven. This is, what I'm going to look like. And I was thinking maybe I'd have all my hair back and all of that. And anyway, there was one gal that wasn't answering, but she looked very confident. And I said, well, what do you think you're going to be like in heaven? And she knew exactly what she was going to say. She said, I'm going to be 3 years old. I said, what? I'm going to be 3 years old. If you knew her story, you would know that she had her innocence taken at 3 years old. Through abuse, she lost some time as a kid. And she said, Jesus told me I was going to get that back. I thought, wow, that's exactly right. I said, how long are you going to be 3? She said, I don't know, maybe a couple thousand years, but I'm going to be 3 for a long time because I missed it. Jesus is telling us through the manna and through the white stone, I am going to restore everything that was taken from you, everything that the deceiver took away. I'm going to restore it and make it new. I will provide everything you need. Do not compromise. Do not seek that somewhere else. I will provide, and I will even give you a new name. So I'm going to ask you again. What is your name? What is your name?